Stop everything for a moment because the feeling you have been trying to ignore is not leaving by accident. Something about these past few weeks has felt different, hasn't it? You wake up tired even after sleeping 7 or 8 hours, your mind never fully quiet, your chest heavy for reasons you cannot explain. People around you keep talking, life keeps moving, notifications keep flashing across your phone screen, but deep down it feels like something inside you has slowly gone silent. And maybe the strangest part is that you cannot even explain what is wrong anymore. You tried to tell yourself it was stress, bills, work, responsibilities. Maybe just another rough season. But late at night, when the house gets quiet and the television is off, you feel it again. That strange pressure. That feeling like something important is trying to reach you before it is too late. Last Thursday, a man sat alone in the parking lot outside a 24-hour grocery store just after 1:30 in the morning. His hands were gripping the steering wheel while rain tapped softly against the windshield. He had just checked his email for the 15th time that night, hoping for one message that never came. He kept replaying every mistake he thought he made over the last 2 years. Every missed opportunity. Every relationship that quietly faded. Every plan that somehow collapsed right before it worked. And sitting there under the pale glow of a broken parking lot light, he whispered something he had not said in months. He asked if anyone was still listening. Maybe you know that feeling better than you want to admit. The feeling of talking into silence for so long that eventually you stop expecting an answer. You still smile around people. You still show up to work. You still say, "I'm fine," because it is easier than explaining the exhaustion living underneath your skin. But there are moments lately where something interrupts you. A random memory while driving home. A song you have not heard in years suddenly playing in a store aisle. A strange feeling telling you to slow down even when you cannot explain why. And every time it happens, part of you brushes it off while another part quietly wonders if there is a reason you keep being stopped in the middle of your routine. Because what if the delays frustrating you right now are not accidents? What if the silence surrounding your life has not been punishment at all? You have been telling yourself that closed doors mean failure, that unanswered prayers mean abandonment, that waiting means you were forgotten. But what if something has been protecting you this entire time in ways you could not yet understand? Tonight, before you rush back into distractions, before you bury yourself in noise again, pay attention to the heaviness you have been carrying. Not because it is there to destroy you, but because sometimes the moments that feel the most confusing happen right before everything finally begins to make sense. The strange thing was not that life became difficult. The strange thing was how everything started slowing down all at once. Calls stopped coming back. Plans that once felt certain suddenly fell apart without explanation. People who used to text every day became distant almost overnight. Even small things began feeling unusually heavy, like answering emails, walking through crowded stores, or sitting through conversations that once felt normal. And somewhere deep inside, you started wondering if maybe you were the problem. Maybe you had missed your moment. Maybe everyone else was moving forward while your life stayed frozen in place. The man from the parking lot drove home that night with the radio off because even music felt exhausting. He passed the same gas station he had stopped at for years, but this time something inside him told him to keep driving. He could not explain it. It was only a feeling. Quiet. Persistent. Almost like an invisible hesitation sitting in the passenger seat beside him. When he finally got home, he did what he always did when the loneliness became too loud. He opened his phone and scrolled mindlessly for nearly an hour trying to escape his own thoughts. But no distraction lasted very long anymore. Every quiet moment pulled him back into the same questions. Why does everything feel delayed? Why does it feel like life keeps stopping right when something good is about to happen? Why do certain doors close so suddenly after he worked so hard to open them? Maybe you have asked yourself those same questions lately. Maybe you have been trying to stay hopeful while secretly feeling embarrassed by how tired you are. Because there is a kind of exhaustion that sleep does not fix. It comes from carrying disappointment for too long without understanding why it keeps happening. And the hardest part is that nobody else can fully see it. They see you functioning, showing up, smiling when needed. But they do not see the moments where you sit alone staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning replaying every decision you wish you could undo. They do not hear the thoughts you never say out loud, the fear that maybe your life is quietly drifting away from the future you once imagined. But lately there have been interruptions you cannot fully ignore anymore. Tiny moments that feel strangely personal. A memory surfacing out of nowhere while sitting at a red light. A familiar phrase repeated by 3 different strangers in the same week. A sudden feeling telling you not to go somewhere you originally planned to be. None of it dramatic enough to explain to anyone else. Yet somehow impossible to completely dismiss. And maybe that is what unsettles you most. The possibility that something deeper has been happening underneath all the confusion. Because what if these delays are not random? What if every closed door, every uncomfortable pause, every moment where things unexpectedly fell apart was preventing something you could not yet see? The man did not know it yet, but the email he never received that night would eventually lead him somewhere he never planned to go. Somewhere that would completely change the meaning of everything he thought he lost. But at that moment, sitting alone in the dim blue glow of his kitchen light with the clock quietly reading 2:17 a.m., all he could feel was the silence. By the next morning, nothing around him had really changed, but somehow everything felt heavier. The coffee tasted bland. The drive to work felt longer than usual even though it was still the same 18 miles down the interstate. Every billboard, every traffic light, every person rushing through their routine looked strangely disconnected, like the world kept moving while something inside him remained stuck in place. He sat at his desk pretending to focus while the same thoughts circled endlessly in his mind. Maybe this is all life is now. Maybe the waiting never ends. Maybe some people are simply meant to watch everyone else move forward. That thought stayed with him longer than he wanted to admit. Because disappointment had slowly changed the way he saw himself. At first he used to believe delays were temporary. Then after enough unanswered prayers, enough plans collapsing without warning, enough nights spent wondering what he did wrong, the delays stopped feeling temporary and started feeling personal. Quietly, without even realizing it, he began measuring his worth by everything that failed to happen. And maybe you have done the same thing. Maybe you tell yourself you are being patient, but deep down you are exhausted from trying to stay hopeful while life keeps confusing you. Maybe you have reached the point where you no longer expect good news because disappointment has trained you to lower your expectations before anything can hurt you again. The strange thing about emotional exhaustion is that it rarely arrives all at once. It happens slowly. One cancelled opportunity. One unanswered message. One more night staring at the ceiling wondering why everything feels so distant. Until eventually you stop talking about your dreams altogether because saying them out loud makes them feel foolish. Around lunchtime, the man stepped outside the office building hoping the cold November air might clear his thoughts. He stood near the edge of the parking garage watching gray clouds roll across the city skyline while people hurried below carrying takeout bags and coffee cups. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. For a second his chest tightened with hope, but it was only a fraud alert from his bank. He laughed quietly to himself, not because it was funny, but because lately every moment seemed to carry the same pattern. A brief spark of expectation followed immediately by emptiness. As he slipped his phone back into his jacket, something unusual caught his attention. An older man sitting alone on a nearby bench was staring out at the same skyline with a peaceful expression that felt strangely out of place in the middle of such a rushed afternoon. For a moment their eyes met, and the older man simply nodded as if he somehow understood something no one else could see. It lasted only a second before the man looked away again, but the feeling stayed with him long after he returned inside. Small moments like that had been happening more often lately. Tiny interruptions that carried a strange sense of meaning even though they made no logical sense at all. And somewhere underneath all the frustration, a quiet question had started growing louder. What if these interruptions were not distractions? What if they were attempts to slow him down before he walked into something his exhausted mind could not yet understand? That night he could not fall asleep no matter how hard he tried. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of cars passing outside his window. He turned over in bed again and checked the clock glowing beside him. 2:41 a.m. Somehow the silence felt louder at night, like every thought he pushed away during the day came back stronger in the dark. He reached for his phone out of habit, scrolling through old photos he had not looked at in months. Pictures from years earlier when life felt lighter. Smiles that looked more genuine. Plans that still felt possible. He stopped on one photo taken during a weekend trip near the Oregon coast. In the picture he was standing near the edge of a cliff overlooking the ocean while the sky behind him glowed orange from the setting sun. He remembered that trip clearly because it happened right before everything started falling apart. Before the failed relationship. Before losing the promotion he had worked toward for nearly 3 years. Before the constant feeling that life kept slipping through his hands no matter how hard he tried to hold it together. For a long moment he stared at the photo wondering what happened to that version of himself. Not just happier, but certain. Certain that life was moving somewhere meaningful. Now every step felt uncertain. Even simple decisions carried hesitation. He had become someone who second-guessed everything because too many things had gone wrong too many times in a row. And maybe you understand that feeling. The feeling of becoming emotionally careful because hope has become expensive. You stop expecting things to work out because disappointment has taught you to prepare for silence instead. That is what nobody talks about when people go through long seasons of waiting. It is not only the delay that hurts. It is the way the delay slowly changes your relationship with hope itself. Around 3 in the morning he finally sat up and walked into the kitchen for water. The city outside his apartment looked almost frozen, streetlights casting pale reflections across wet pavement after the evening rain. He stood there quietly when suddenly his phone lit up on the counter beside him. His heart jumped for a second even though he knew nobody texted him this late anymore. But it was not a message. It was a notification from a calendar reminder he forgot to delete years ago. The reminder simply read, "Do not settle for what drains your spirit." He frowned, trying to remember when he wrote it. Then slowly another memory surfaced. He had typed that sentence during one of the hardest moments of his life after ignoring his instincts and forcing himself into situations that left him emotionally empty. Standing there in the dim kitchen light, something about those words felt strangely alive again. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just clear. And for the first time in months, a thought quietly crossed his mind that he could not shake. What if the exhaustion he had been fighting was not only coming from disappointment? What if part of it came from constantly trying to force doors open that were never meant for him in the first place? The next few days felt strangely different after that night in the kitchen. Nothing dramatic changed on the surface. He still woke up to the same alarm at 6:15 every morning. He still sat in traffic surrounded by exhausted faces staring blankly through windshields. He still walked through fluorescent office hallways carrying coffee that went cold before noon. But underneath the routine, something had shifted quietly inside him. He started noticing how often his life had been interrupted right before certain things happened. Not once or twice, but repeatedly. Plans collapsing at the last second. Delays that made no sense. Opportunities disappearing after months of effort. At first he had labeled all of it as failure because that was the easiest explanation. But now another possibility had begun to disturb him in a completely different way. What if some of those disappointments had actually been protection? The thought stayed in the back of his mind Thursday afternoon when his coworker invited him to meet a new business contact downtown after work. Normally he would have forced himself to go even if he felt drained because he had spent years believing every opportunity had to be chased immediately before it disappeared forever. But this time, something inside him hesitated. It was not fear exactly. More like an unexplainable heaviness every time he thought about going. He tried ignoring it. Tried convincing himself he was overthinking. Yet the feeling only became stronger as the day went on. By 5:30 he finally texted an excuse and drove home instead, frustrated with himself the entire way. Halfway through the drive rain started pouring hard enough to blur the highway lights into long streaks across the windshield. Traffic slowed to nearly a crawl while emergency lights flashed somewhere farther ahead in the distance. Sitting there gripping the steering wheel, he suddenly remembered another moment from years earlier when he ignored the same kind of feeling. Back then he had rushed into a relationship because he was terrified of being alone. Everyone around him said it looked perfect from the outside. Stable. Comfortable. Predictable. But deep down something always felt wrong. He ignored every warning sign because he thought loneliness was worse than settling. By the time it ended, he barely recognized himself anymore. Not because someone destroyed him, but because slowly, over time, he abandoned his own instincts trying to hold on to something that drained him. Emotionally. That memory stayed with him as rain hammered against the roof of the car. And for the first time he began realizing how often exhaustion enters a person's life when they keep forcing themselves toward things that were never aligned with who they truly are. Maybe that is why some delays feel painful at first. Because they interrupt attachments you were emotionally convinced you needed. Maybe you have experienced that too. A door closing that felt devastating at the time. A relationship ending. A move falling through. A job opportunity disappearing. And maybe years later you quietly realized that if things had worked out the way you desperately wanted back then, your life would have led somewhere far more empty than you could see at the time. The frightening part was not realizing how much had been delayed. The frightening part was beginning to wonder how many unseen things he had already been protected from without ever knowing it. By Friday evening the feeling became impossible to ignore. It was no longer just exhaustion or disappointment. It felt more like standing in the middle of a conversation you could not fully hear yet somehow deeply understood. Everywhere he went, small interruptions kept appearing at exactly the right moment. That afternoon he reached for a book in a crowded store and another copy slipped off the shelf beside it. The page it opened to contained a sentence underlined by someone years earlier that read, "Sometimes the wrong path feels urgent because fear is louder than peace." He stood there frozen for a second staring at those words while strangers moved around him carrying shopping bags and coffee cups, completely unaware of the storm quietly unfolding inside his mind. He bought the book without even reading the title. Later that night he sat alone in his apartment with only a lamp glowing beside the couch while rain tapped softly against the windows again. The city outside looked blurred and distant through the water streaking down the glass. He opened the book to the same page and reread the sentence over and over because something about it unsettled him deeply. Not because it sounded dramatic, but because it explained something he had been unable to understand for years. Fear had been driving almost every major decision in his life. Fear of being left behind. Fear of disappointing people. Fear of ending up alone. Fear of missing his only chance. And because of that fear, he had spent years chasing things that never brought peace once he finally reached them. Suddenly memories began resurfacing faster than he could stop them. The job he fought desperately to keep even though it drained him emotionally every single day. The relationship he begged to save long after it stopped feeling honest. The opportunities he forced himself toward simply because everyone else said they looked successful from the outside. In every situation there had been warning signs. Quiet discomfort. Restlessness. Strange hesitation. But he ignored all of it because he thought peace was something you earned after enough struggle. Maybe you have done that too. Maybe you have spent years overriding your own spirit because you believed forcing yourself harder would eventually make things work. But what if peace was never supposed to feel forced in the first place? What if the exhaustion inside you is not proof that you are failing, but proof that you have been fighting against something trying to redirect your life all along? Around midnight his phone buzzed unexpectedly with a message from an old friend he had not spoken to in nearly 2 years. The message was simple. "I do not know why, but I felt like checking on you tonight. Hope you are okay." He stared at the screen longer than he should have because lately moments like this kept happening at exactly the moments he needed them most. Tiny reminders arriving through ordinary people. Ordinary timing. Ordinary interruptions. Yet somehow carrying a weight that felt impossible to dismiss. And sitting there in the quiet glow of the apartment while thunder rolled faintly in the distance beyond the city skyline, he slowly began realizing something that both comforted and frightened him at the same time. Maybe the silence in his life had never been empty. Maybe something had been quietly guiding him away from places his exhausted heart was never meant to stay. The strange part about being emotionally exhausted is that eventually you stop reacting to disappointment altogether. You still feel it, but in a quieter way. Less dramatic. More numb. By the following week he noticed himself moving through life almost automatically, like someone going through routines they no longer fully believed in. He answered emails without reading them twice. He nodded through conversations at work while his mind drifted somewhere far away. Even laughter around him sounded distant, as if everyone else existed behind a layer of glass he could no longer break through. And deep down, a dangerous thought had started growing stronger. Maybe this is just who I am now. Maybe the waiting never changes. Maybe some people spend their whole lives standing outside doors that never open. That thought frightened him more than loneliness itself because he remembered who he used to be before disappointment reshaped him. There was a time when he believed life carried meaning even during difficult seasons. A time when he trusted his instincts without constantly second-guessing every step. But after enough delays, enough silence, enough closed doors appearing right when he needed answers most, something inside him slowly became cautious. Smaller. Quieter. Maybe you understand that feeling too. The moment where hope begins feeling embarrassing instead of comforting. You stop telling people what you really want because explaining your dreams starts sounding foolish after years of waiting. You pretend you are fine with less because admitting your disappointment out loud feels too vulnerable. Late Wednesday night he drove 20 minutes outside the city without any real destination in mind. The highway stretched dark and empty beneath low clouds while distant headlights flickered across wet pavement. He turned off the radio halfway through the drive because lately silence felt more honest than noise. Eventually he pulled into a small overlook near the river where he used to go years ago whenever life became overwhelming. The place looked almost unchanged. Same rusted railing. Same dim parking lot lights buzzing softly in the cold air. Same wide stretch of black water reflecting the city skyline in the distance. He stepped out of the car and leaned against the railing, breathing in the freezing November air while wind pushed against his jacket. For several minutes he said nothing. He just stood there carrying the weight he had been trying to outrun for months. Then unexpectedly, his eyes filled with tears before he even understood why. Not loud tears. Not dramatic. Just the quiet kind that arrive after someone has been strong for too long without feeling understood. In that moment he realized something painful. He had spent years begging life to move faster while completely ignoring what the constant pressure was doing to his spirit. Every delay felt personal because he believed progress was the only proof his life mattered. But standing there in the silence beside the river, another thought slowly surfaced underneath the exhaustion. What if slowing down was not the punishment he thought it was? What if the pauses frustrating him were actually preventing him from building a future on top of fear, loneliness, and emotional desperation? A cold gust of wind moved across the water as the city lights flickered in the distance, and for the first time in a very long while, the silence around him no longer felt entirely empty. The next morning he woke up feeling strangely lighter, not because his problems had disappeared, but because something inside him had finally stopped fighting the silence quite so hard. For the first time in months he did not immediately reach for his phone the second he opened his eyes. He just lay there staring at the pale morning light moving across the ceiling while the events of the past week replayed slowly in his mind. The missed opportunities. The delays. The relationships that faded. The plans that collapsed at the last minute. For years he had connected all those moments to failure, convinced they were proof that life was passing him by. But now another possibility had begun taking shape, and once he saw it, he could not unsee it. What if the things he cried over were the exact things that quietly saved him? The realization hit him hardest later that afternoon while cleaning out an old storage box in the back of his closet. Inside were journals, receipts, old apartment paperwork, and a folded letter from nearly 4 years earlier. He almost threw it away before recognizing the handwriting. It was from the company he once dreamed of working for, the job he was devastated to lose after making it through 3 rounds of interviews. He remembered how crushed he felt when they rejected him. At the time he believed losing that opportunity meant his future had collapsed. But as he sat on the floor rereading the letter, another memory surfaced that he had completely forgotten. Less than a year after that rejection, the company went through massive layoffs and shut down several offices across the country. Former employees posted online about burnout, toxic leadership, and people losing jobs with almost no warning. He sat there stunned, staring at the paper in his hands while a chill moved through him. Back then he thought the closed door ruined his future. Now he realized that same closed door may have protected him from building his life inside something that would have slowly drained him emotionally and financially. Suddenly dozens of moments from the past few years started reconnecting in his mind differently. The relationship that ended before he moved across the country. The apartment deal that unexpectedly fell apart days before signing the lease. The friendships that disappeared during seasons when he felt most abandoned. At the time every loss felt cruel and confusing. But looking back now, he could finally see how many of those situations were already carrying warning signs he ignored because he was desperate for certainty. Maybe you have done that too. Maybe there are things you still mourn simply because you never saw what they would have eventually become. Sometimes people grieve closed doors without realizing those same doors were hiding rooms filled with exhaustion, emptiness, and versions of themselves they were never meant to become. Sitting there surrounded by old memories scattered across the floor, he realized the silence in his life had not been punishment. The delays had not been rejection. Somehow, in ways he could not fully explain, he had been redirected over and over again even while believing he was being abandoned. And for the first time in years, instead of feeling angry about the waiting, he felt something far more unsettling and comforting at the same time. Gratitude for the things that did not work out. Over the next several days, his entire past began looking different to him, almost like someone had quietly adjusted the lighting in a room he thought he already understood. Things he once labeled as failure suddenly carried a different meaning. The strange delays. The uncomfortable endings. The moments he thought life was ignoring him. Piece by piece, they no longer looked random. One evening after work he stopped at a small diner a few blocks from his apartment, the kind with faded booths, warm yellow lights, and old country songs playing softly through worn speakers. He slid into a corner booth near the window while rain tapped lightly against the glass outside. Across from him sat a young couple barely speaking while staring at their phones, and for some reason the sight pulled him into another memory he had not revisited in years. He remembered sitting across from someone he once believed he could not live without. Back then he ignored the constant tension because he was terrified of starting over. He convinced himself that loneliness was worse than unhappiness. But now, looking back honestly, he realized how emotionally exhausted he became trying to force something that never truly brought peace. At the time the breakup felt like losing his future. He spent months replaying conversations, wondering what he could have done differently. But sitting there in the quiet diner years later, he finally understood something painful. He was never grieving the relationship itself as much as he was grieving the future he imagined it would give him. And maybe you have done that too. Sometimes people hold on to things far longer than they should because they are emotionally attached to who they hoped they would become through them. A relationship. A career. A dream. A version of life they built in their mind. But when those things collapse, it feels personal because it forces you to face the terrifying possibility that your plans were never fully aligned with your peace. The waitress refilled his coffee before he even asked, and as steam curled upward from the mug, another realization settled quietly over him. So much of his suffering came from trying to outrun uncertainty. He chased control because uncertainty made him feel unsafe. But in the process, he ignored every moment where life tried slowing him down long enough to protect him from decisions driven by fear instead of clarity. He remembered the apartment he almost moved into 2 years earlier simply because he was desperate for a fresh start. At the last minute the landlord stopped responding and the deal fell apart. He was furious at the time. Weeks later he learned the building had severe flooding issues that left several tenants displaced during winter storms. Again and again the same pattern appeared. The things he begged life to give him often carried hidden burdens he could not yet see. And the things that disappeared unexpectedly often created space for something healthier later, even if it took years to understand why. As he stared out through the rain streaking across the diner window, he realized something most people never fully understand while they're still in the middle of waiting. Sometimes protection does not feel comforting when it first arrives. Sometimes it feels like silence. Sometimes it feels like confusion. Sometimes it feels like losing the exact thing you thought you needed most. But maybe the deepest forms of guidance rarely arrive through control. Maybe they arrive through interruption. By the time December arrived, something inside him had changed in a way he could not fully explain to anyone else. The circumstances of his life still looked ordinary from the outside. He still lived in the same apartment. Still worked the same job. Still drove the same route through crowded streets lined with glowing storefronts and exhausted commuters rushing home beneath cold evening skies. But internally, the panic that once followed every delay had started loosening its grip. Not completely. There were still nights where uncertainty crept back into his chest while lying awake. In the dark. Still moments where he wondered how long it would take before life finally felt stable again. But now, underneath the uncertainty, there was also a growing awareness that maybe he had misunderstood the silence all along. One Saturday afternoon he visited his parents for the first time in several weeks. The house smelled like cinnamon candles and fresh coffee while old holiday music played softly from the kitchen radio. As he helped his father carry storage boxes down from the attic, they stumbled across a dusty cardboard container filled with old family photographs. Hours passed without either of them realizing it while they sat on the living room floor flipping through memories frozen in faded colors. There were pictures of birthdays, road trips, awkward school portraits, and moments he barely remembered living through. Then suddenly he stopped at one particular photo taken during his senior year of high school. In the picture he was smiling beside a girl he once believed he would spend his entire future with. At the time, losing that relationship shattered him so deeply that he thought he would never recover emotionally. He remembered begging life to bring it back. Remembered believing that losing her meant losing the only future that would ever make him happy. But now, years later, he could barely recognize the desperate version of himself trapped inside that memory. Not because the relationship was bad, but because he finally understood how little he knew about who he would eventually become. The dreams he had back then no longer matched the person sitting on the living room floor now. And that realization opened something inside him. Maybe the reason certain doors closed was not because he was unworthy. Maybe it was because his understanding of what he truly needed was still incomplete. Maybe you are experiencing that right now without realizing it. Maybe there are things you still ache for simply because your current perspective cannot yet see what they would eventually cost you emotionally. Sometimes people mistake attachment for destiny because both feelings can be equally intense in the moment. But attachment often comes from fear, while peace arrives quietly. Peace does not beg. It does not chase desperately. It does not leave you constantly exhausted trying to hold everything together. Later that evening while driving home beneath strings of Christmas lights glowing across quiet neighborhoods, he noticed something else for the first time in years. The constant pressure to force his future into existence had started fading. Slowly. Imperfectly. But noticeably. And in its place came something unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. Trust. Not certainty about exactly what would happen next. Not sudden answers to every question haunting him. Just a quiet trust that maybe the interruptions in his life had not been random obstacles after all. Maybe they were signs guiding him away from futures that looked right on the surface but would have slowly disconnected him from himself over time. A few nights before Christmas, he found himself awake again long after midnight, sitting on the floor beside the living room window with only the glow of city lights filling the apartment. Snow had started falling lightly outside, soft enough that it barely made a sound as it drifted across the empty streets below. The world looked quieter than usual, almost suspended in time. In past years nights like this would have made him feel painfully alone. The silence used to feel like proof that nobody saw what he was carrying. But now the quiet felt different somehow. Not empty. Just still. He wrapped his hands around a mug of coffee that had already gone cold while memories continued surfacing one after another in his mind. The strange thing was that he no longer looked at those memories with the same bitterness. Even the painful ones seemed softer now, as though time had finally revealed meanings hidden underneath the confusion. He thought about all the nights he spent blaming himself for delays he could not control. All the moments he believed life had forgotten him simply because things were not happening according to his timeline. And suddenly he realized how exhausted he became trying to interpret every silence as rejection. Maybe you know that exhaustion too. The constant need to explain why things have not worked yet. The pressure to compare your life to everyone else moving forward around you. Watching people get married, buy homes, change careers, build families, while secretly wondering why your own path feels slower and harder to understand. Social media only made it worse sometimes. Endless photos of smiling faces and life milestones while you sat awake questioning whether you had somehow fallen behind without realizing it. But sitting there beside the window while snow quietly covered the city, another truth slowly settled over him. Not every life unfolds on the same schedule. Some people are protected through acceleration. Others are protected through delay. And maybe the waiting seasons people resent the most are often the seasons quietly shaping them into someone capable of carrying the future they keep asking for. Earlier that evening he received another unexpected message, this time from someone he used to work with years ago. The message was short and simple. Just wanted to say you were one of the few people who always made others feel calm during difficult times. I never forgot that. He stared at the words longer than he expected because lately he had spent so much time focusing on what was missing from his life that he forgot who he had become while surviving it all. The waiting had changed him. The silence had changed him. The disappointments had deepened his compassion in ways success never could have. Suddenly he understood something that once would have sounded impossible to him. Maybe some seasons are not only about receiving what you asked for. Maybe they are also about becoming someone stronger, softer, wiser, and more grounded before the next chapter finally arrives. Outside, the snow continued falling beneath the pale glow of streetlights while the apartment remained perfectly quiet around him. But for the first time in years, the silence no longer felt like abandonment. It felt more like something patiently staying beside him while the rest of his life slowly began making sense. The days after Christmas passed quietly, almost gently, and for the first time in a long while he stopped feeling the need to force meaning out of every moment. He still had unanswered questions. His future still looked uncertain in many ways. There were still mornings where anxiety returned before his feet even touched the floor, and evenings where loneliness crept back into the apartment the second the world outside became quiet. But something fundamental inside him had changed. The panic was no longer controlling every thought. The silence no longer felt like an enemy waiting to swallow him whole. One cold Sunday morning he woke earlier than usual just before sunrise. The city outside remained dark except for a faint blue glow beginning to spread across the horizon. Instead of reaching for his phone, he pulled on a jacket and walked outside into the freezing air. The streets were nearly empty, covered with thin patches of snow melting beneath yellow streetlights. He walked slowly without headphones, without distractions, simply listening to the sound of his own footsteps against the pavement. For years he had filled every quiet space with noise because silence forced him to confront emotions he did not know how to carry. But now, walking through the stillness of the early morning city, he realized something unexpected. Peace had not arrived through finally controlling his future. It arrived the moment he stopped interpreting every delay as proof that his life was failing. As he passed a small neighborhood church, the bells began ringing softly through the cold air. The sound echoed down the empty street while sunlight slowly touched the tops of nearby buildings. It was such a simple moment, yet something about it stayed with him. Nothing dramatic happened. No sudden miracle. No instant answer explaining every painful season he survived. Just a quiet awareness settling deeper into his spirit. He thought about the version of himself from months earlier, sitting alone in parking lots at 1 a.m. convinced his life was falling apart because things were not happening fast enough. He remembered the exhaustion of trying to force closed doors open. The desperation to make certain relationships work. The fear of being left behind while everyone else seemed to move forward effortlessly. But now he could finally see what he was too emotionally overwhelmed to understand back then. Some doors closed because they were never connected to peace. Some delays happened because he was not ready for what he thought he wanted. Some silences existed not to punish him, but to slow him down long enough to hear parts of himself he had ignored for years. Maybe you are in that kind of season right now. A season where everything feels uncertain and unfinished. A season where life seems quieter than you expected and answers arrive slower than you hoped. But not every quiet season means you are lost. Sometimes it means your life is being carefully redirected beneath the surface in ways your current perspective cannot fully understand yet. As the morning sun reflected across melting snow and warmed the empty streets around him, he realized the heaviness he carried for so long had started loosening little by little. Not because every problem disappeared overnight, but because he no longer believed the waiting meant he was abandoned. And somehow that realization changed the way everything around him felt. By the end of January, life still did not look perfect, but for the first time in years he no longer needed it to in order to feel okay. The city remained cold and gray most mornings, the kind of winter where sunrise arrived slowly and people hurried through sidewalks with their heads down against the wind. His routines were still simple. Coffee before work. Quiet drives through familiar streets. Evenings spent in the same apartment where so many lonely nights once felt unbearable. Yet something about those spaces no longer carried the same weight they used to. One evening after work he stopped at the overlook by the river again, the same place where weeks earlier he stood convinced his life had stalled beyond repair. This time the water looked calmer beneath the fading orange light stretching across the horizon. Cars moved quietly in the distance while the city skyline reflected softly against the river below. He leaned against the cold railing and breathed slowly, noticing how different the silence felt now compared to before. It was no longer screaming questions at him. It was no longer demanding immediate answers. It simply existed beside him, peaceful and still. And standing there, he realized the biggest change was not that his circumstances had suddenly transformed. The biggest change was that he finally stopped seeing himself as abandoned during the waiting. For so long he believed every delay meant he was being forgotten. Every closed door felt like proof that life worked for everyone except him. But now he understood something he could not have understood earlier because pain had been speaking louder than perspective. Some things had to fall apart before he could recognize how tightly fear had been controlling him. Fear of loneliness. Fear of failure. Fear of missing his chance. Fear of not becoming enough. Those fears once pushed him toward situations that looked right on the outside but quietly disconnected him from his peace. And maybe that is where you are right now. Standing somewhere between exhaustion and understanding. Looking back at all the things that did not work out while slowly beginning to realize they may have protected you in ways you still cannot fully measure yet. Sometimes the hardest part about waiting is that you do not get immediate explanations. You only get moments. Small interruptions. Quiet feelings. Unexpected pauses. Tiny reminders arriving at exactly the right time. And only later, sometimes years later, do you finally look back and understand why certain doors never opened no matter how desperately you tried to force them. The wind moved softly across the river while lights from nearby buildings flickered against the darkening water. He reached into his pocket and silenced the phone buzzing with another notification he no longer felt desperate to check immediately. For the first time in a long while, he felt no need to rush ahead searching for proof that everything would work out. Somehow the constant pressure had faded. Not because every answer arrived, but because he finally trusted that not all silence means absence. Some silence protects. Some silence redirects. Some silence quietly holds you together while parts of your life rearrange themselves beneath the surface. As the last light disappeared behind the skyline and the cold evening settled gently around him, he stood there a little longer without trying to escape the quiet. And for the first time in years, the future no longer felt like something he had to chase in fear. It felt like something slowly approaching in its own time.